You're listening to Blockchain 2025. The future is right now. Every week, we explore implications of the technology underpinning cryptocurrencies. Blockchain.
Each episode is a standalone examination of one industry broken into 3 segments. A basic overview, blockchain's disruptive impact, and relevant crypto projects.
Blockchain 2025 is part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Learn about Bitcoin, create a wallet, and buy your first Satoshis all at Bitcoin.com.
Now, Equifax is one of the big 3 credit reporting agencies, the companies who keep financial data on all of us so that people like lenders and landlords can decide whether or not we are trustworthy. So Equifax controls some of our most sensitive information, and about a month ago, we learned this.
Breaking news from the credit monitoring company Equifax. Cyber thieves making off with private information of 143 million Americans, nearly half the U.S. population.
It's actually worse. It's now 145 million Americans, and I've got good news and bad news there. The good news is that by private information, they don't mean your Google search history. So nobody yet knows about the time you searched for Wario porn, parentheses, real, or world's richest dogs looking for assistance, or can loneliness cause the farts? But the bad news is the information they got could well be all this.
It's your name, social security number, birth date, driver's license, and addresses where you lived. Information that is mostly permanent unless you're in federal witness protection.
Welcome to the Season 3 finale of Blockchain 2025. This is Matt Aaron.
And this is C. Edward Kelso from the news desk out at Bitcoin.com.
Yeah, man, it's been a fun season. Last week, we talked about iglob.net and had a little fun at one of the more silly ICOs out there. This week, we're going to talk about an industry and ICO that's very worthwhile, in my opinion, which is credit scores. We'll go into that in a second. But before we start, we couldn't have done this without, first off, Isabel Chaparro. She is our producer, editor, makes us sound more eloquent than we actually are. So Isabel, she's number one. She's the most important thing to this whole network. And then obviously Emily Delara, who does, she writes all the social media posts and helps with the timestamps. She gets people to listen to find the show. And then Laura, who just came on to Bitcoin.com, Laura Dorwart, she is the PR writer. So when we have newsworthy content and want to get linked to another publication, she takes care of that. So, it's been a great team effort, to say the least.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the time with you guys. And super impressed by Isabel, Emily, and Laura and all that they do. So thank them very, very, very much.
For sure. We probably should have brought them up on the Woman in Blockchain episode, but that's okay. We'll remember that for season 4. But yeah, at least better late than never.
Sure.
And yeah, so it's been cool. And the traffic's going up, and even in this bear run. So that's cool. Yeah, man. Kelso, I'm also recording in a weird kitchen in Airbnb, and I had to turn the AC off. It's about 80 degrees in here. Ooh. So for my own health, let's go straight into the show.
Sure.
So yeah, I mentioned it, man. Credit scores. Credit scores on the blockchain. But Kelso, help us kick it off. Credit scores, FICO, Equifax, applying for mortgages, loans, credit card limits. What's the current state of credit scores?
It's just miserable. And, I've said it a million times. I'm a go-go capitalist, and I definitely believe in reputation. That's super important. But from the U.S. perspective, which is what I'm most familiar with, we have, for lack of a better phrase, a monopoly in what's known as the Fair Isaac Corporation, or colloquially, we understand that as FICO, FICO. It's sort of the vanguard. It's where all the different companies have gone to. Now you can look at that as, some sort of sinister cabal or whatever. It really has evolved over 60 years, 60. They were created in the late 50s. And it's how the credit system in the United States has kind of gone. But it's a really, really terrible system, lots of flaws in it. And there hasn't been any punishment on the market side, which is where the cabals do come in, and the cartelization does come in on the market side, because these guys, FICO is doing nearly $1 trillion in business, And yet, just ask any American, do you swing a dead cat and you'll hit 4 or 5 people who are just, they'll give you horror stories about how, someone took their identification, or there's some sort of misnomer or problem with their credit reports, bad information, and on and on and on and on and on and on. And there's almost nowhere else to go. So in the United States, it's a huge problem.
For sure. And FICO has a 90% market share. So
yeah,
over 90%. So I call that a monopoly.
Sure.
And so let's bring it out to the world, right? And this is for US lenders, but worldwide, we've talked about this, and this is one of the reasons for Bitcoin is around 40% of the world's population does not have a bank account. 3 billion, so we're getting closer to 50% there, are unable to obtain a credit card. And 91% of residents in the developing world have trouble getting financing. And the vast majority, Kelso, when they do get financing, it's loan sharks, 50% interest or very high interest rates.
Yeah, a book a few years ago was written called Merchants of Misery. And in some ways, from the capitalist side of things, thank God these guys exist, these payday loan services and so on, check cashing places, because they wouldn't have recourse, lower socioeconomic folks in the United States to, getting access to their capital. But on the other hand, which is the point of the book, it's just predatory. They're just completely all over these people. The interest rates on that money, it's just phenomenal. It's 30, sometimes 40%. And when we say they're unbanked people, I think a lot of people are confused and thinking we want to build like a Bitcoin bank to... No. We want to unbank 7 billion people. But what we mean by that is access to the financial system is what we're trying to get at here. And there are gatekeepers like FICO, which is considered a private company, and Matt's working on sort of an international idea now in the US. But internationally, there are problems with getting at credit in a variety of different ways, right? There's not like in the US, just one reporting agency. It's actually a government function, right?
That's 100% right. So Kelso, not only do we have these centralized storage of credit info, but centralized interpretation of the data, right? In China, your credit score is affected by your political opinions.
Right.
France, Portugal, and Spain, where I am right now, they don't have credit scores.
Mm-hmm.
They only can give you negative information, like negative check marks on your file. And a lot of countries in Europe, they just have debit cards. They don't have credit cards. In the United States, you need to have credit cards in order to gain credit, right? That's one of the main ways to do it.
Right.
And the UAE, or the United Arab Emirates, religious restrictions on lending have prevented the development of a credit reporting system entirely.
Yeah, with credit, it sounds really dry and really unsexy, but it really is the sort of the king of interdisciplinary studies. And how I say that, or why I say that, is you mentioned the UAE. The UAE obviously is predominantly Muslim. They have very strict, depending on who's interpreting it, of course, strict religious laws against usury, against interest, against loans. And so there's a bunch of ways that they get around this and kind of reconfigure and figure things. But religion plays a huge role in credit and what that means. In other words, this is this is not a new problem that we're looking to solve. This is a problem. Access to capital, access to credit is sort of the lifeblood of innovation. It's the lifeblood of being able to buy a home in some countries, access to an education in other countries, and on and on and on. But I'm sorry to interrupt on the UAE thing.
Well, yeah, no. I mean, Kelso, that's a very cogent point. Yeah, I mean, in UK, also, you have to be registered to vote. That will affect your credit. Like if you're not registered to vote, it will affect your credit score, right? And we covered voting on the blockchain, turning your cell phone into a voting booth in Blockchain 2025 in season 3. Check it out. But yeah, man. And so we got to bring up Equifax, right? Everyone remembers the Equifax hack last year. Kelso, what happened in the famous, or infamous, I should say, Equifax hack?
Well, in layman's terms, they were hacked. And just to get right to the punchline there, and I'll let you kind of fill in and shade in the details, because I think you actually, pre-show, you were giving me some information that I honestly hadn't heard. I think the initial reports were 143. So if you're 143 million people were potentially exposed to it. I think they upped that to 145 million Americans. And if you do the math, I think we have, 350 million people here. So you exclude children and some others, and you pretty much have almost the entirety of the United States having their information stolen, taken. because, again, of this centralization. But anyway, on the Equifax thing, there's more to it, right? I'm missing a whole bunch of little factoids.
Yeah, I mean, there's more alarming facts here, and I think it's worth talking about. So, yeah, chances were much higher than 50% that if you were an American adult, that your information was breached. And this is, Equifax has all this credit data, what social security numbers, addresses, credit card numbers, birth dates, tons of personal information. This is a hacker's dream. I'll just go over a couple alarming things here. One being that a lot of people weren't customers of Equifax, but they have their information anyway. Equifax makes money based on selling data, and I think they make a couple $1 billion a year. This is a big company. On top of that, it seems that the higher ups, the C-level execs, knew about the hack.
Yeah, this is crazy. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And the gap between the announcement to the public, they were unloading shares, selling, trying to get out. And right after it happened, what did they do? Their response was offering a free credit monitoring service, but it had a mandatory arbitration clause, basically saying you can't sue us. They got a lot of flack for that as well. So they, even in their cover up, they were not noble. They were still trying to pull a fast one and protect themselves.
Yeah.
And surprise, surprise, fines and, legal repercussions. They never happened with Equifax.
As you're talking, there's so many, I can hear our European listeners going, see, all this emphasis you guys place on private companies and all this capitalist go stuff, and there's nothing equivalent here, and they may have a point, but I think our point ultimately is centralization. And what happens in a centralized system is obviously having a honeypot, like you say, a place where it's a hacker's dream to attack it, but also centralization in terms of government, in the sense that an Equifax can have so many friends in high places that when they are caught with their hands in the cookie jar doing something, if not illegal, completely unethical, they are not held accountable to any sort of the same standards you and I would be had we hacked into someone's database or something and knew about it. There's no liability. Like you say, no one did any jail time, and they violate routinely their own rules. Again, it constantly goes back to centralization.
Yeah. And let's move into part 2, which is the disruption. How can blockchain disrupt? You mentioned having all the information in one place. It's centralized. It's a weak point because hackers know where to go to attack it. When it's on a distributed ledger on a blockchain, you're going to have decentralized credit info. So I think that's very important, just based on the horrendous track record of Equifax. We didn't even mention Cambridge Analytica. But Kelso, I think I've made my point.
Right.
Yeah, having it in a central place is incredibly dangerous going forward.
The system, especially in the United States. So you've outlined some pretty harrowing examples around the world about credit ratings and access. But especially in the United States, this is a giant problem. The system is broken, and I think anybody who looks at it, reasonably would say so. It's so baked in, everything is so weaved into this fabric of our lives. Very few people have any idea as to how to, replace it with something better, because I think we've all sort of grown up with this idea that obviously they need an objective, people who are going to lend to us. Credit scores are huge here in the U.S., and I keep pounding this, but I forgot to mention too that not only for things like renting an apartment or getting a loan for a home, but also now for employment. If you go and you apply for some of these higher end jobs, they want to know if you're a scrub. Do you pay your bills? And that's real important. So the information that they're pulling from the Equifax, the TransUnions, these sorts of places become super important to our daily lives. And again, if you just ask anybody, who's not working for those companies, they will tell you that the system's broken. Now, they'll have their own horror story, they'll have their own problem with it. What we're kind of leading to here is, prior to blockchain and some of these new ways of decoupling or disaggregating data, there really wasn't a satisfying solution.
Yeah. And Kelso, there's a lot of other things that blockchain can do to disrupt credit scores. We mentioned, FICO having a 90% or FICO having a 90% market share. Having competition in interpreting the data and allowing multiple credit rating agencies, the benefits of free market competition, which means lower cost and better accuracy, I think, when evaluating people for credit. Another big thing is worldwide access. And Kelso, you alluded to this. Kelso, do you have a good credit score in the United States?
Yeah, I've a pretty decent one, sure.
Oh, nice, man. So you might be able to get a loan on a house in Southern California. Maybe if Bitcoin has a bull run, you could get a mansion in Malibu. I don't know. But I'll tell you what, man, you go to Vietnam or England or somewhere else, you start from zero. So having a decentralized service where agencies across countries can work together, how cool would that be to go to a new country and already have credit there based on what you've done in the United States?
For sure. And I could see it going the other way too. But before we do that, that really did blow me away. Like, I'd never considered the fact that all the years that I've built up credit here and a good reputation and paid my bills and all that good stuff, I moved to France, I moved to Vietnam, I move really anywhere else in the world. I start from zero again, right? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, dude. Actually, a buddy of mine in Colombia, a pretty successful entrepreneur, he came to Colombia and he started a bunch of restaurants. I'm not saying he's a multimillionaire, but he's doing well. And he'd been there for 5 years before he had enough credit in Colombia to get a cell phone plan that's, around $20 per month. That's after 5 years, and he has a pretty big business there.
Holy mackerel.
There are many examples around the world on the whole credit score system, whether it's trying to get an apartment lease or a house, but they're similar to that.
That's such a great anecdote, because in the United States, we're constantly worried about loose credit, too much credit flowing out, and inflation and all these problems with malinvestment. But then you go to Colombia and you want to talk about tight. Wow.
Yeah, that is interesting. It goes both ways, doesn't it? So maybe in certain countries, they're too tight on credit. And then the Big Short, the U.S. financial crisis, giving someone with a $20,000 income, 5 homes, they can be too loose. So there's all sorts of interesting things there. And so we mentioned the worldwide access.
Right.
Obviously, not having access to a bank account. Think of certain, a lot of people immigrate to the U.S. and they're underbanked. Some youth, they don't have a credit score. They can't get a credit card. So they can't participate. But we'll talk about some ways with blockchain, with kind of a social peer-to-peer vouching system, that kind of a less formal way to create credit for people that don't have bank accounts. I think we covered disruption pretty well, man. I think it's a home run. I think this could be really big. And I would emphasize could, because there are so many noble blockchain projects out there, Kelso, but FICO and Equifax, they're going to go down swinging. And so I'm obviously rooting for Bloom. We're going to talk about Bloom in a second here, but I mean, there are some Stanford alumni, very smart young people, and they have good intentions. We'll play a clip in a second from Jesse Limegruber. And full disclosure, I interviewed Jesse on a previous crypto podcast I had before joining Bitcoin.com, and I have nothing but good things to say about them. I am rooting for them 100%. I'm not saying invest in them because I can't give investment advice. And I think this is worth noting. Listeners, they raised $40 million for half of their tokens, BLT token. That means it was at an $80 million valuation. Today, they're worth $4 million in the crypto bear market, meaning that they've dropped by 95%. And you have to separate the ridiculous ICOs from the potential world-changing, serious, intelligent teams. And Bloom is definitely in the latter. They've still gone down 95%. So I think that should just be a lesson for investors in general that, hey, it's tough to get it right.
That's a haircut, as we like to say. Yeah, and I'm glad we're doing this, because we're kind of crapping on, trying not to cuss, crapping on ICOs for a few episodes now. And I think, we're warranted, and, obviously to warn people about blockchain hype. But then on the other hand, you and I both are fans of the tech. And so it's nice to find a project that we both feel like, hey, there could be something here. And as you stressed, it's not financial advice. We're not asking you to go and invest in a company. We don't have any. I don't own any of the project or anything. But it is, as we've outlined, it's a huge problem. There is a definite need to get in there and do something about this. And again, this may be part of a real viable solution that our listeners may be really, really interested in.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, Bloom's one of those ICOs that I'm really into from a activist standpoint, if that makes sense.
So we have risks of leaks from central parties that are holding your data. They are owning it. It's clear, plain text often, and they are not always the best at security. We've got silos. Corporations do not really work well together, and they especially don't work well together when they have to cross borders. So this is like, to tie it back to credit, if you're an immigrant and you move to the United States, or if you leave from the United States and go somewhere else, your whole credit history resets. Doesn't matter if you have $50,000 of debt or have paid millions and millions of dollars in mortgages. This data does not talk to each other. There's bias in understanding the data. When you trust a central party to make an interpretation of the data, there's huge biases here. Like in China, your political affiliation literally influences your credit score. And in the UK, whether you're registered to vote influences your credit score. In the United States, we have lots of weird things that influence your credit score, like if you've checked it, or if you've closed an old account. And these things are like mathematically proven to not actually matter, but because central parties are trusted to interpret the data, that's how we go.
What is Bloom? Well, they are a protocol, right, that will integrate data, and they want to integrate existing info from private companies and credit bureaus, governments. They hold all this data. So if all these organizations, they want to get that data onto the blockchain, the good news is that I don't know if all of it is, but some of this data you can get access to. So they'll be able to get access to some of these records because it's public domain. Then they need to organize all this data. Lenders will come on, hopefully, and use this to issue loans. And then users can come on from the other side and own their identity protocol and use their Bloom credit identity to live and to be a financial member of the world capitalist system.
And you're saying bloom as in a flower blooms, BLOOM, right?
Yeah, good point there. BLOOM.
Yeah. So far, the way you've framed it is really good. The bottleneck there, I think, is going to be getting lenders to acknowledge it. I think we're going to probably have to start off with, I'm thinking of other projects like Salt. It doesn't have to be Salt, but other projects like Salt, crypto lending projects that are kind of natural, stepsisters and stuff of this industry that are going to have to hook up with projects like Bloom to get us going, maybe before some of the fiat-based companies can get in there. But it sounds really interesting. So back up a little bit. You said they raised $40 million. They're now worth $4 million, which is a really, really appropriate cautionary tale here when looking at ICOs. So their main focus is to become like a FICO, so to become like a Fair Isaac Corp, but decentralized?
Yeah, so it's a decentralized protocol, right? So again, Bloom, the company, won't access information. Big difference.
Okay.
I'm sure Jesse would cringe, like, you want to become a FICO? Like, no. That's why we're doing this in the first place.
Okay.
But yeah, the Bloom protocol, right? So
right.
In the current system, lenders have to pay for this identity verification and credit risk assessment. They pay for this.
Yeah, something like 15, like each, he did a real interesting talk one time I saw, and he was saying that, we're constantly being data mined, and each one of our personal information package, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but we're being data mined for about $100-$200 a year is what each of us is worth, depending on the company. But that companies that are looking for our information, so to pull it, have to pay something like $10 to $15 each time they go there, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when you're lending to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, more people, that can get super expensive very, very fast.
Exactly. And so that's why it's really interesting. So they have the network, right? And lenders, every time that $15 pull for a credit score, these entities on the network that assess risk and will serve as what FICO does, right? They'll be able to set prices and receive payments for it on the Bloom network using the BLT token, that's the token that powers the network. That will be the currency to pay for credit checks.
Right.
And it's also worth noting that the Bloom token allows people to vote on the future of the protocol and, the features. So yeah, I think it's just an incredible infrastructure there. If this thing works, if they can get the data on there and get the buy-in on all sides, I think that would be amazing. Being able to have cross-border credit scoring, lowering the price for credit checks, democratizing this information, allowing all types of risk assessment companies and lenders to have access to it, as opposed to having to go through FICO, and make it cheaper and available to more people. Having more accurate information is also something that could be a result of this, being able to aggregate more information.
Right. There are just so many problems that are to be solved here. This is such a rich environment for entrepreneurs. And Bloom, sounds really, really ambitious. This sounds like a lot to bite off and chew, but hopefully they'll make some traction in the space. Like you say, there's some really smart guys. Looking at their deck of people on their team, very, very impressive. Beyond that, I think the model, say outside of the wealthier countries in the world, is to kind of look at microfinancing. And this is a trend that is sort of thwarted by the legacy system, because as we've just announced, it costs businesses 10, 15, 20 bucks just to look at your information. That's got to be passed on. They have to recoup that cost at some point, even if they do have tremendous volume. And so that instantly prices out people from the third and fourth worlds. So to lessen those costs, you can then, because not everybody needs, a $500,000 loan for a home or $30,000 loan for a car, but maybe you do need access to capital for, a business you'd like to start, maybe to pilot a fruit cart or, whatever it is that's going on in your particular village or part of the world. And man, that Colombia example you gave is just sitting in my head. 5 years to get a cell phone plan. Just imagine, obviously that's, a foreigner, obviously, but imagine that compounded over time, people who may want to go to not Colombia, but to Colombia to improve that society, to bring in their foreign capital or to bring in their know-how or whatever else. Could you imagine what it's like in other places where you the friction there is, now you understand why they're relatively poor, right? Because it's so illiquid. It's so impossible to get access to capital. So everybody's just kind of stuck. Man, so the Bloom idea is really, really fascinating.
Totally, man. There are some cool things that we'll briefly touch on. They have a Bloom credit card that will use Ethereum or Ether.
I saw that.
Based on your credit score on the... Mm-hmm. And so they got other couple things in the roadmap. We'll see how it all plays out. One last thing I want to talk about is this peer-to-peer staking, meaning you mentioned informal economies, but the idea being that you can vouch for a friend or a cousin or another company, saying that this person, I'm willing to stake my credit score, a little bit of my credit score on this other person. So kind of this peer-to-peer credit understanding. I think that's quite interesting.
Well, that's how it's been done.
Yeah.
It's really how credit has worked throughout society. Another great study was done about 30, 40 years ago called A Credit to Their Community, which talked about early European Jews coming over to the United States. And you want to talk about having trouble. They were openly discriminated against and could not get, the very least of their troubles was getting access to capital. So what did they do? They sort of, the first comers would leave money in the bank, vouch for the newcomers, lend it out to them, and so on. This is how societies have worked throughout time. It's really interesting that technology is kind of solving an issue by doubling back to an old way of doing things. If they can stake for you, like who better to know you, right, than the people closest and the people around you?
Yeah, man. So they are bringing back something that's worked for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. It's cool when blockchain, a nascent technology, implements something that's worked for a long time that we've gotten away from recently, at least in certain parts of the world. But yeah, finishing up here, check them out. Hello, Bloom, HELLO, hello, Bloom, BLOOM.io. Again, we did this podcast on our own. Bloom did not sponsor us or anything like that. We just wanted to cover credit scores, and Bloom, to us, is the most interesting project in the space. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that there aren't other interesting projects in the space in credit scores, but kudos to them for trying something really cool.
Yeah, and that's, again, something that in the last few episodes here that we've been struggling with. It's much, much, much easier to find ICOs that are scams and silly and ridiculous, but I like that we're ending this third season here on a project that we both feel is worthy. So yeah, I hope they do well. I'd like to see other people involved in it. I'd like to see more companies looking at this issue because it's so vast, it's so enormous that I don't think one ICO can tackle it.
For sure. Well, listeners, thanks so much for being with us for season 3, and we have a lot of cool things planned for season 4. Yeah,
man, I can't wait. Thanks for having me this season. Really appreciate it. Thanks to the entire team. And head over if you can, if you've got time, to news.bitcoin.com and you can keep up with the daily news there as well. So thanks again, Matt. I've really appreciated our time together.
Yeah, and I'll just finish up there. News.bitcoin.com. Check it out. I think we have a great team. I'm obviously biased, and we cover everything in the Bitcoin world. Yeah, Humans of Bitcoin, you could argue, is our flagship podcast, along with This Week in Bitcoin and Blockchain 2025. But we're covering a lot of cool stories, man. We have John McAfee coming up soon. We're doing more kind of on the ground human stories in, barrio of San Pedro, Los Angeles to South Africa, how cryptocurrency is affecting people's lives. And Eric Voorhees is coming on the show. We got some cool guests coming up there. So head over to podcast.bitcoin.com. and you can find everything there.
Thanks again, and we will see you guys next season.
Thanks for listening to the Bitcoin.com podcast network. To learn more about our shows, visit bitcoin.com/podcast. Bitcoin.com podcast network.